Hi, this is Sean, and in this lesson we're going to look at a particular section on the blues, jazz blues, and we'll look at the use of the harmonic minor scale there, the kind of thing that I used to do in Barry Harris workshops, and you'll hear this sound in jazz all the time. We'll look at plenty of tips and tricks of how to get it in your playing as well. If you're interested in more like this, then come and join us on Jazz Skills. We'll get you fluent in the first place with a developing fluency course. Meanwhile, please do give us a like, hit the subscribe and the notification bell so you know when I upload new content. It's really helping us to grow and do more of this for you. Without further ado, let's get into the lesson. Harmonic minor scale. What I'm going to do is let's take the G harmonic minor scale. For newer people, that's the G major scale with a flat 3 and a flat 6. Okay, so that's our harmonic minor scale on G. So the thing with jazz is we've got to come to the improv with some good solid scale foundations, right? And I think there's a tendency, I'm not sure if you can relate to this, there's a tendency to think of scales, especially if you come from a classical background, as things that are just there for your fingers or just there to pass your grade 3 examination or something like that, right? But the thing is, everything we do comes from scales. And in jazz, we do not have the benefit of time. Everything is done in real time. We don't rehearse solos. I can't get away with just knowing a few licks and that idea, you know? We've got to have freedom in the scale. So, thing with the harmonic minor scales is I don't really use them for minor very much. I tend to use them more for minor 2/5s. So for example, let's say I've got that A minor 7 flat 5 to D7. That's the minor 2/5 in the blues. There are many different ways of playing these two measures, but we're going to stick to the harmonic minor and these changes, right? You can kind of ignore this in the blues. That's just in my track, so the bass player does what I hope the bass player will. It's really F7 and then you can go A half diminished to D7, or you can just take F7 and D7 for a bar, right? And by doing that you end up with a 1 6 2 5 progression, right? Very typical jazz progression, which is the same thing here. Okay, so you see, the thing is, when you have a minor 2/5 like that A minor 7 flat 5 to D7, that comes from, even if I voice it, whether I voice it with that extra note diminished voicing for me, some people say it's a dominant with a flat 9, fine, that all comes from the G harmonic minor. So one thing I learned from Barry that really stuck in my head was he used to say chords come from scales, not the other way around, right? There's a tendency, the way, I guess the narrative when I was starting was that you learn the chords and then you learn scales to go over the chords. I don't really want to give you that impression because I think I'm a much more functional player. In more modern tunes, there can be less function. By function, I mean all the standard chord progressions we teach on Jazz Skills members. You know exactly what I'm talking about. People who follow me on YouTube will know a bit about that as well. And so I'd look at that and say that's a minor 2/5. The A half diminished comes from G harmonic minor. Let's see. 1, 2. If I take alternate notes, that's my chord 2 in G harmonic minor. If I do the same on the 5th, I get a D7 by taking G harmonic minor notes. So clearly those two chords come from G harmonic minor, so that's my scale. Now, how do we do that? That's where it gets interesting, right? First thing is to know it, of course. Take it from an A. Another thing we used to do in Barry Harris workshops was run scales one short of an octave, not a whole octave, because the rhythm just seems to figure out better. So if it was from root, it will be root to 7th and back down. So say, for example, if it was from G, it would be like that. If I go from A, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4, so that's one short of an octave again, right? Now, if you have two bars, let's say that we had this A half diminished from here, right? So let's say that A half diminished took up that previous bar instead. And let's say it was A half diminished for a bar and D7 for a bar. Then I could go up and down, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4, and that's how my practice would begin. And then I would take it from all kinds of different scale points, doing the same one short of an octave and back. Can anyone guess what goes wrong for most of my students as soon as we start doing that kind of work? Because otherwise this is just throwing information out if we don't also talk about what are the pitfalls, where do people almost always go wrong? Virtually always. Joe, you nailed it. Rhythm. All those other things you mentioned, everybody else, yeah, they're all important, but the rhythm, what people end up doing, because they don't realize they'll do it when they're just watching a webinar, because it all makes sense to their ear. But what people end up doing is stuff like this. 1 and 2. That's one thing they do. They put the D7 in the completely wrong place just because it feels like it should go in a particular place, which shows they're not counting, right? So the practice of improv for me is linked completely with rhythm. It's not a separate thing. You don't add rhythm on later, right? So if you're counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4, you won't go wrong. If you're thinking it's probably here, which is what most people do, then you'll probably go wrong. The other thing that people do wrong all the time, I want you not to fall into these traps, which is why I'm telling you, is, sometimes people say, oh, you just say what not to do. You're not saying what to do. I'm telling you what to do by telling you what not to do, right? So people do this. They slow down for the chord changes. And if you do that, the fluency won't come, right? So what's really important to realize is that there are two things that we can practice in improv for me. Two main things. They're not the only two things, two main things. And that is, number one, creating short phrases. And the other is making the joins. If we're practicing those two things as we go, then we won't go wrong. But if we're only practicing these are the notes, that's not going to take us very far. That's not going to prepare us for what happens when we don't just play all the phrases we played in the practice studio yesterday. Not realistic, right? What you have to practice is a way of working, a method. So a couple of phrases based on that. Let's see. We only really have one bar of that scale, right? We only really have this area. And therefore, I'm just going to take... Probably heard Charlie Parker do something like that a million times, right? So, you know what Barry used to do for this kind of progression? He would see that harmonic minor scale as an F7 that descends to the third of D. Let's say if you did have A half diminished for a bar and then the D7, then he would think of it as the F7 scale up down to the third of D. I'm not sure if you can see where the benefit is in that, but it's actually quite a lot because everything you know how to do on F7 applies. That's a Barry Harris scale. Half step under the third chord of F7. It's one of the Barry Harris rules. If you're descending from the 2 of F7, 2 extra notes. These are my 2 extra notes. So it's chromatic between the 2 and 7. And then we're on that third of D, right? Can you see how by the time we've raised that F to here, we end up with a G harmonic minor anyway? So it's only another way to conceptualize the same thing, but it means that if you practice a lot of stuff on dominant, which you would in the blues anyway, I'll point there because that's really where it is, then you can use all that stuff over that F7. Now, it doesn't matter if you've got A half diminished here for a bar. Let's just put in a half diminished sign for simplicity. To D7, same thing because it's the same scale. It doesn't matter if you've got F7 going to just D7, same scale. It doesn't matter if you've got, let's see, is there another way to do it? Yeah, the way it's written, F7 for a bar and then A half diminished to D7. None of that stuff matters when you're thinking functionally. So I would practice on that zone, maybe F7 up for the F7 bar. Switch to the G harmonic minor, which is also just like the F7 scale with a raised F. Rebecca, why can you use A half diminished for F7? Because it's all about the destination. First of all, they're very similar, as we just saw. Let's see. Maybe not right on that point. Let me think about this. Maybe if we didn't use the B diminished, Rebecca, it could be just, I've heard somebody do stuff like something like this, where this is still B flat 7, and then that B flat 7 leads to A half diminished because it's the tritone. It's a half step above it. And so that could be a reason to do it. Even if it doesn't happen on your blues, it's going to happen a lot of the time, yeah? Okay, the time I couldn't really do the stuff we've been talking about is if that's A minor 7th and not A half diminished, because then that E natural comes into it. Okay, that's our first principle, using a harmonic minor scale over a dominant. Hope you enjoyed that. Consider joining us on Jazz Skills, where we have a developing fluency course to teach you the language and get you fluent playing it. So it's not just academic information, and much more after that, including improvisation, voicings, movements, rhythm, accompanying, support from me and a vibrant community. You name it, we've got it. Take care. Bye for now.